Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're putting on our historian hats to investigate the deep roots of a truly universal human pursuit. We're looking at the unbroken thread of reproductive autonomy throughout history.
Okay, let's dive into this. When you hear the phrase birth control, your mind probably jumps straight to the 1960s, right? You think of the invention of the pill and the sexual revolution. But what if I told you that the quest for sex without pregnancy predates the modern era by literally thousands of years? Deliberate pregnancy prevention is definitely not a 20th century invention.
Section 1. A universal, ancient desire. Let's set up our historical lens right from the jump. The evidence shows us that wherever human civilization produced written records, whether we're talking about ancient Mesopotamia, India, or China, they documented attempts to control reproduction. It wasn't some fringe idea. It was a completely universal concern. Just look at the absolute oldest documented evidence we have. The Kahun gynecological papyrus from ancient Egypt dates all the way back to 1825 BCE. This incredible text contains what are basically the oldest written contraceptive prescriptions in existence. And one of the recipes? It describes an internal barrier device made from fermented dough mixed with, of all things, crocodile dung.
Yeah, you heard that right.
Now, I know using crocodile dung sounds absolutely alarming today, but it actually paints a really fascinating picture of ancient medicine. If we compare this ancient Egyptian recipe to modern chemical standards, it wasn't just pure magical thinking. See, crocodile dung is alkaline, and modern science confirms that alkaline environments are highly hostile to sperm, which actually prefer a slightly acidic pH. The fermented dough would have just added to that effect. So, while it certainly wasn't flawlessly reliable, it was a genuine early attempt at evidence-based medicine. They were applying direct chemical logic to a biological problem. But what about before written records even existed? Well, archaeological and skeletal studies of prehistoric hunter-gatherers consistently show a birth spacing of roughly 3 to 4 years, and that wasn't an accident. Much of this spacing was achieved through extended breastfeeding, often until a child was 2 or 3 years old. This causes lactational amenorrhea, which essentially suppresses the hormonal signals that trigger ovulation. Alongside a few other deliberate practices, early humans were actively managing their fertility using whatever biological tools they had.
Section 2. Pharmacological reality versus mechanical efficacy.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we have to categorize ancient ingenuity. We really need to separate physical, mechanical barriers from complex biochemistry. On one hand, you had genuine engineering solutions, like wool pessaries soaked in olive oil, and later on, physical coverings made from animal intestine or tortoiseshell. These were strictly mechanical solutions to a mechanical problem. On the other hand, you had pharmacological approaches, like using honey. Modern research actually confirms honey has mild antimicrobial and spermicidal properties. So again, these weren't random superstitions. They were practical, engineering, and biochemical solutions born from generations of observation.
Perhaps the most dramatic and honestly tragic example of this ancient pharmacological reality is silphium. This was a highly prized plant that grew exclusively in a specific region of North Africa. It was so incredibly valuable for its powerful contraceptive and abortifacient properties that it was actually depicted on ancient coins. It was traded at prices that made it literally worth its weight in silver. The ancient demand for reproductive control was just so intense and so unyielding that silphium was harvested entirely into extinction by the 1st century CE. An entire species was consumed out of existence because it was just that medically and economically crucial.
Beyond silphium, humanity discovered, through trial and error, that plant secondary metabolites often interact with mammalian reproduction. For instance, the seeds of the wild carrot, or Queen Anne's lace, contain compounds that modern research confirms interfere with progesterone. Pomegranate seeds contain phytoestrogens. But we have to remember that this ancient medicine came with some dangerously severe trade-offs. Take white lead, which was recommended in ancient Greece. It's a highly effective spermicide, sure, but tragically, it also causes deadly lead poisoning over time. Ancient risk assessment wasn't exactly up to modern clinical standards, but the extreme lengths people went to really highlights just how desperately these solutions were needed.
Of course, we also have to mention methods that required 0 ingredients. Withdrawal, or coitus interruptus, is documented in virtually every traditional society in history. Modern estimates place its efficacy rate anywhere from 73% to 96%, entirely depending on consistent and correct use. As a completely free, always available method, its universal appeal across the entire span of human history makes perfect sense.
Section 3. The Great Ovulation Miscalculation.
Now we need to look at a major complication in ancient medical history. While they definitely understood the concept of a fertile window, ancient medical traditions suffered from a fundamental misunderstanding of the female biological clock. For all their vast plant knowledge, their biological timing was completely backward. Hippocrates, the famous Greek physician, claimed that conception was most likely immediately after menstruation. But modern biological reality shows us ovulation occurs mid-cycle, about 2 weeks before the next period. So the tragic irony here is that anyone trying to use an ancient rhythm method was practicing abstinence at exactly the wrong time, giving themselves a totally false sense of protection. Unbelievably, this massive error wasn't fully corrected until the 1930s.
Section 4. Status, Survival, and Society.
Let's broaden our historian's lens here for a moment. The motivation for avoiding pregnancy wasn't just a personal lifestyle preference, it was deeply, deeply embedded in social and economic structures. A woman's status dictated both her access to and her absolute need for these methods. Think about the intense life-or-death realities across different classes in places like ancient Rome. Enslaved women had the most urgent need for contraceptive knowledge, driven by the harrowing reality of sexual violence and the desperation to prevent a child from being born into slavery. For free citizens, marriage was an economic alliance. Having too many children could strain household resources, and severe adultery laws made reproductive control a high-stakes necessity. And for sex workers in Greece and Rome, finding methods that actually worked was quite literally a matter of basic occupational survival.
To understand just how integrated this was into daily life, consider the Roman poet Ovid. Writing in the 1st century BCE, he mentions contraception totally casually in his poetry. He treats it as an unremarkable, everyday background detail. Now, as a historian, uncovering this kind of casual reference feels like striking gold. Because when a poet doesn't even feel the need to explain a practice to their audience, it proves that this knowledge was an everyday reality, not some rare, obscure medical specialty.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how legal history actually confirms medical reality. The Talmud, compiled over several centuries, contains extensive legal debates on the permissibility of contraceptive methods, like an oral preparation called the cup of roots and a sponge barrier called the mak. Think about it. You don't write lengthy, rigorous legal and religious arguments about the conditions under which something is permitted if that something reliably does nothing. These intense debates prove these methods work to a meaningful degree.
Section 5. The Hidden Network of Women.
We've reached the climax of our historical investigation. We know the methods, and we know the intense societal demand. But we need to identify the true keepers of this ancient medical knowledge. The history we actually have written down mostly comes from elite male physicians. Take Cyrannus of Ephesus, a 2nd century CE Greek physician practicing in Rome. He brought a surprisingly sophisticated clinical approach to the topic. In his texts, he carefully distinguishes between contraceptives that prevent pregnancy and abortifacients that terminate it, organizing everything factually by reliability and safety. It was highly organized, written medical history.
But here's the reality check. That was the elite text. The vast majority of practical, applied knowledge lived completely outside formal medical books. It was an undocumented oral tradition, often called grandmother's knowledge. This was herbal and practical information shared informally among women, passed quietly from mother to daughter. This knowledge was shared between women in the same community in an unbroken, intergenerational chain of careful observation and application.
So the crucial point is the massive gap between the written record and daily life. While elite male physicians systematically wrote the surviving texts, those texts heavily underrepresent what was actually happening on the ground. The grandmother who told her granddaughter exactly which plant to brew into a tea didn't write it down, but her knowledge was almost certainly far more widely practiced. Generations of women, driven by absolute necessity, formed an informal, undocumented network that actively bridged the gap from ancient trial-and-error medicine to modern clinical contraceptive science.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought. Today, we finally have the advanced clinical science and the reliable hormonal methods that our ancestors were striving for over thousands of years. But has the fundamental desire changed at all? The pursuit of reproductive autonomy wasn't just magically invented in the 1960s. It's a profound, unbroken thread of control that is exactly as old as humanity itself. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this leaves you looking at history in a completely new light.